April 30th, 1945, 3:30 p.m. The Führer bunker, Berlin. Deep beneath the crumbling capital of the Third Reich, Adolf Hitler raises a Walther pistol to his right temple. In just moments, one of history's most infamous lives will end. But as the gunshot echoes through the concrete corridors, a genealogical secret dies with him. A family truth so shocking that it would have destroyed everything he believed about himself. Who was Adolf Hitler really? Where did this bloodline begin? What Hitler never knew, what the world has only recently discovered through DNA analysis, forgotten church records, and decades of genealogical detective work, was that his family's story began not with Germanic purity, but in the melting pot of Central Europe, where his ancestors lived, worked, and even served families that he would later target for extinction. This bloodline spans 8 generations across 220 years, weaving through the Habsburg Empire, crossing religious boundaries, and revealing connections that would have horrified the Führer himself. From Catholic peasants in Bohemian villages, to a potential Jewish merchant connection, from illegitimate births that left gaps in the official record, to DNA evidence that tells a story Hitler never could have imagined. The documents show a family constantly on the move: Austrian peasants, Czech border dwellers, and mysterious gaps that genealogists are still trying to fill. Multiple name changes, questionable paternities, and a genetic heritage that contradicts every principle of the racial ideology Hitler would champion. This is the story of how a mixed heritage family from the Austrian-Czech borderlands, people who embodied the very ethnic diversity Hitler would later condemn, produced history's most notorious anti-Semite. Through 8 generations of survival, adaptation, and gradual social mobility, we'll trace how a bloodline marked by uncertainty, illegitimacy, and cultural blending created the man who would obsess over racial purity. Each generation reveals another layer of irony, another contradiction between the family's actual history and the ideology their descendant would embrace. The stakes couldn't be higher. Understanding Hitler's ancestry doesn't excuse his crimes, but it does reveal how a family's hidden shame and uncertain identity may have shaped the psychological foundations of genocidal hatred. Adolf Hitler was born on April 20, 1889, at 6:30 p.m. in the Gasthof zum Pommer Inn, Braunau am Inn, Austrian Empire. The birth certificate, preserved in Austrian archives, lists his father as Alois Hitler, customs official, age 52. His mother, Clara Pelzel Hitler, age 29. But this seemingly straightforward record hides immediate family complications. Adolf was the 4th of 6 children, but only he and his sister Paula would survive to adulthood. His older half-siblings, Alois Jr. and Angela, came from his father's previous marriages, a pattern of complex family relationships that would mark Adolf's early years. The household dynamics were explosive. Alois Hitler Sr., a strict authoritarian with a violent temper, clashed constantly with young Adolf. Contemporary accounts describe a father obsessed with order and a son who rebelled against every attempt at control. This wasn't just normal father-son conflict. This was a battle between 2 fundamentally incompatible personalities, fought in a home where genealogical secrets lurked just beneath the surface. The family's financial situation reflected the anxieties of the Austrian lower middle class. Alois earned a respectable salary as a customs official, enough to employ domestic servants and maintain middle-class appearances, but the family's peasant origins were never far from consciousness. Neighbors in Leonding described the Hitler household as tense and formal, with Alois demanding absolute obedience and Adolf responding with increasing defiance. What none of them knew was that this authoritarian dynamic masked deeper insecurities about the family's legitimacy and social standing, insecurities that would profoundly shape Adolf's later obsession with power and control. Alois Hitler, born Alois Schicklgruber on June 7, 1837, in the Austrian village of Strones, represents our first genealogical mystery. Alois was born to Maria Anna Schicklgruber, an unmarried 42-year-old peasant woman. The father's identity was never officially established, a crucial gap that would plague the Hitler family for generations. Church records from the Dullersheim parish show that Maria Anna gave birth alone, with no father listed on the baptismal certificate. This illegitimate birth in Catholic Austria carried enormous social stigma, making Alois's later rise to government position all the more remarkable and psychologically significant. In 1876, nearly 40 years after his birth, Alois suddenly changed his name from Schicklgruber to Hitler. Church records from Dullersheim show he claimed legitimacy through Johann Georg Hiedler, who had married his mother in 1842, 5 years after Alois's birth. But genealogists have uncovered serious problems with this story. Johann Georg Hiedler couldn't write his own name, yet he supposedly provided detailed testimony about his paternity decades after the fact. The priest's records show suspicious alterations, with different ink and handwriting suggesting later additions. 3 local men testified to Alois's legitimacy despite decades passing since the alleged father's death. Testimony that appears to have been purchased rather than given freely. Even more troubling, genealogical research suggests that Johann Georg's brother, Johann Nepomuk Hiedler, may have been Alois's actual father. Local records show that Johann Nepomuk raised Alois in his household from infancy, providing him with education and opportunities that led to his government career. Some historians believe the name change from Schicklgruber to Hitler was meant to hide this closer family connection, which would have made the relationship inappropriate even by 19th century standards. The truth about Alois's paternity died with the generation that knew it, leaving Adolf Hitler as the descendant of a genealogical mystery that would have horrified his racial ideology. Clara Pelzel, Adolf's mother, presents our second genealogical complication. Born August 12, 1860 in Spittal, she was actually Alois's second cousin and his ward. Their relationship began when she was just 16, working in his household as a domestic servant. Church records reveal that Alois required special papal dispensation to marry Clara because of their blood relationship. This fact made Adolf himself the product of what his later racial laws would classify as undesirable, close relative breeding. The marriage took place on January 7, 1885, when Clara was 24 and Alois was 47, an age gap that reflected the power dynamics of their relationship. Contemporary accounts describe Clara as a devoted but anxious mother, constantly worried about her children's health and social standing. She had already buried 3 infants before Adolf's birth, creating a household atmosphere of anxiety about survival and legitimacy. Neighbors in Linz remembered her as a quiet woman who rarely spoke about her family background, maintaining the secretive behavior that characterized the Hitler family for generations. Her relationship with Alois was marked by submission and fear. She addressed him as Uncle Alois, even after their marriage, a reminder of their complicated family connection. The Hitler household was a study in Central European cultural complexity. German was the primary language, but the family lived in the multi-ethnic borderlands where Czech, German, and local dialects mingled daily. Alois's work as a customs official meant constant movement between Austrian towns with mixed populations, Passau, Lambach, Leonding, each exposing young Adolf to the ethnic diversity he would later despise. In Passau, the family lived in a neighborhood with Czechs, Hungarians, and Jews. In Lambach, Adolf attended school with children whose parents spoke multiple languages at home. This early exposure to ethnic mixing may have created the psychological foundation for his later obsession with racial purity, a reaction against the diversity that defined his childhood environment. Economically, the family experienced the anxiety of the lower middle class, comfortable enough to employ servants, but always conscious of their peasant origins. Alois had climbed from illegitimate birth to a respectable government position. Still, this social mobility came with its own psychological costs, a constant need to prove respectability that his son would inherit and magnify. The family's social status was precarious, dependent entirely on Alois's government salary and his ability to maintain middle-class appearances despite his questionable background. The religious environment was formally Catholic, but practically complicated. Alois had grown skeptical of church authority, while Clara remained devout. This religious tension, combined with the family's geographic mobility and uncertain social status, created an atmosphere of rootlessness that would profoundly shape Adolf's psychology. Church attendance was irregular, religious observance was minimal, and young Adolf grew up with a complicated relationship to Catholic authority that would later manifest in his complex manipulation of religious imagery for political purposes. Maria Anna Schicklgruber, Adolf's paternal grandmother, was born around 1795 in the village of Strones, the Austrian Empire. The records paint a picture of a woman struggling at the very bottom of rural society. Church registers describe her as a spinster who worked as a domestic servant for various local families. Her illegitimate pregnancy with Alois in 1837 would have been scandalous in Catholic Austria, marking her as a fallen woman and making her son's later success all the more remarkable. Contemporary accounts describe her as hard-working but troubled, carrying the burden of single motherhood in a society that offered few opportunities for independent women. But here's where the genealogical mystery deepens. In 1938, just months after Hitler's rise to power, Hans Frank, his personal lawyer, investigated rumors about the Führer's ancestry. Frank claimed he found evidence that Maria Anna had worked for a Jewish family named Frankenberger in Graz, and that the family had paid child support for her son Alois for 14 years. Modern historians debate this claim. Some dismiss it as post-war fabrication designed to shift blame. Others point to circumstantial evidence that can't be ignored. No records of payments to Maria Anna Schicklgruber have been found in Graz archives, but the systematic destruction of Jewish community records during the Holocaust makes verification impossible. What remains clear is that Maria Anna worked as a domestic servant in households throughout the region, and the possibility of Jewish ancestry cannot be definitively ruled out. Johann Georg Hiedler, the man Alois eventually claimed as his father, was born around 1792, also in the Waldviertel region. Marriage records show he was a mill worker and small farmer who married Maria Anna in 1842, 5 years after Alois's birth. Contemporary accounts describe him as a simple man who could neither read nor write, making his later testimony about Alois's paternity all the more suspicious. Genealogists have uncovered a troubling detail. Hiedler's brother, Johann Nepomuk Hiedler, may have been Alois's actual father. Local records suggest Johann Nepomuk raised Alois in his household, and some historians believe the name change from Schicklgruber to Hitler was meant to hide this closer family connection. Johann Nepomuk Hiedler emerges as perhaps the most significant figure in Hitler's ancestry. Born around 1807, he managed to accumulate enough land and wealth to take in his nephew, or son, Alois, and provide him with the education that enabled his later social mobility. Tax records from the Waldviertel show Johann Nepomuk gradually acquiring property through strategic marriages and land purchases during the agricultural reorganization following Napoleon's defeat. His success created opportunities for Alois that wouldn't have existed otherwise, beginning the family's pattern of upward social mobility through bureaucratic service. On the maternal side, Adolf's maternal grandparents present a clearer but equally humble picture. Johann Baptist Pölzl and Johanna Hiedler, yes, another Hiedler connection, were small farmers in the Waldviertel. Their marriage in 1848 united two families that had been neighbors for generations, creating the genetic bottleneck that would make Alois and Clara's marriage technically incestuous under Catholic law. Church records show the Pölzl family had farmed the same small plots for generations, surviving through subsistence agriculture and occasional day labor on larger estates. Their daughter Clara's marriage to her cousin Alois represented a step up in social status. Still, it also concentrated the family's genetic heritage in ways that 19th-century science was just beginning to understand. Tracing back to Adolf's great-grandparents, We enter a world of Austrian peasants whose lives were shaped by the massive historical forces of the early 19th century. The Napoleonic Wars ravaged Central Europe from 1803 to 1815, bringing armies, diseases, and economic chaos to every village in the region. Martin Schicklgruber, Maria Anna's father and Adolf's great-grandfather, was born around 1763 during the reign of Empress Maria Theresa. Records from the Waldviertel show he was a small farmer who struggled to maintain his few acres during decades of warfare. Tax records indicate he lost most of his livestock to requisitions by both French and Austrian armies, forcing his family into poverty that would affect generations. Martin's wife, Anna Schicklgruber, died young, leaving him to raise his children in a region devastated by war. Church burial records from 1809 show massive casualties from typhus and other diseases that followed the armies across Central Europe. The Schicklgruber family survived, but just barely, living in conditions that modern observers would recognize as desperate poverty. This experience of survival against overwhelming odds created psychological patterns that would echo through generations: an obsession with security, a distrust of authority, and a willingness to do whatever was necessary to climb the social ladder. The Hiedler lineage reveals similar patterns of survival against overwhelming odds. Johann Hiedler, Johann Georg's father, lived through the 7 Years' War, 1756-1763, the European theater of the American Revolutionary War and the early Napoleonic campaigns. Church burial records describe him as a day laborer, the lowest rung of rural society, working other people's land for survival wages. His family moved frequently, following seasonal work and fleeing the armies that regularly swept through the region. This geographic mobility became a family trait, passed down through generations that would never establish deep roots in any particular place. But the most significant great-grandparent may be Johann Nepomuk Hiedler, the man who likely was Alois's birth father. Born around 1807, he lived through the collapse of the Holy Roman Empire, the Napoleonic occupation, and the reorganization of Central Europe under the Austrian Empire. Unlike his relatives, Johann Nepomuk managed to accumulate modest wealth through strategic marriages and land purchases during the agricultural reorganization following Napoleon's defeat. His success enabled him to take in and educate Alois, beginning the family's climb toward respectability and government service. The surname Schicklgruber itself reveals important genealogical clues about the family's origins. The name appears to derive from Schickl, a Czech word for small field, combined with Gruber, German for digger or farmer. This linguistic evidence points to the family's origins in the ethnically mixed borderlands where Czech and German cultures blended for centuries. Church records from the Waldviertel show multiple Schicklgruber families throughout the 17th and 18th centuries, consistently associated with small farming and day labor. The persistence of the Czech linguistic element suggests the family maintained connections to Slavic culture even as they adopted German. Administrative language.DNA analysis conducted on the Hitler family line in the 21st century has revealed fascinating genetic markers that contradict everything Hitler believed about racial purity. Studies of Hitler's confirmed relatives show Y chromosome haplogroup E1b1b, historically associated with North African and Mediterranean populations, and notably common among Sephardic Jews. While this doesn't prove Jewish ancestry, it demonstrates the genetic diversity of Central European populations that Hitler's racial ideology completely ignored. The presence of this haplogroup suggests migration patterns that brought Mediterranean populations into Central Europe over many centuries, creating the genetic mixing that characterized border regions like the Waldviertel. Additional genetic markers point to Celtic, Slavic, and possibly Turkic ancestry in the Hitler family line. These findings align with archaeological evidence from the Waldviertel, which shows continuous occupation by different ethnic groups over more than 2 millennia. Roman inscriptions record Celtic tribal names. Medieval documents show Slavic settlement. and Ottoman records indicate population movements during the Turkish invasions of the 16th and 17th centuries. Hitler's ancestry reflects this complex ethnic heritage, making his later obsession with Germanic purity a psychological reaction against his family's actual multicultural background. The Pelzel line traces back even further, with records suggesting origins in the Czech regions of Bohemia and Moravia. The name Pelzel appears in 16th-century records from villages along the Danube, often in connection with river commerce and small-scale trading, occupations that brought different ethnic groups into contact. Church records from Spital show the Pelzel family maintaining connections with Czech-speaking communities well into the 18th century, with bilingual church services and Czech naming patterns persisting for generations. This linguistic diversity would have been normal in the Habsburg borderlands, but it contradicts Hitler's later claims about pure Germanic heritage. The earliest documented Hitler ancestor is Caspar Hiedler, born around 1550 in the Waldviertel region during the reign of Holy Roman Emperor Ferdinand. This places Adolf's ancestry firmly in the Central European peasantry during the era of the Protestant Reformation and the Ottoman Empire's push into Europe. Church records from this era are fragmentary, but they reveal families constantly adapting to survival challenges. The Hiedler name appears in various spellings: Hiedler, Hütler, Hitler, suggesting either literacy problems or administrative inconsistencies typical of pre-modern record-keeping. Caspar lived through extraordinary historical upheavals that shaped his family's survival strategies. The Ottoman siege of Vienna in 1529 brought Muslim armies to within 50 miles of his village, forcing local populations to develop skills in hiding resources, fleeing danger, and adapting to rapidly changing political situations. The Protestant Reformation divided his region between Catholic and Lutheran influences, creating religious tensions that required careful navigation of competing authorities. The 30 Years' War, 1618 to 1648, would devastate Central Europe, killing an estimated 40% of the population in some regions. Families that survived this period developed psychological traits that would echo through generations: suspicion of authority, religious flexibility, and an obsession with security that could manifest as both extreme caution and sudden violence. Archaeological evidence from the Waldviertel reveals a region where Celtic, Germanic, and Slavic populations had mixed for over a millennium. Roman inscriptions show extensive trade networks, medieval documents record Czech settlement, and genetic studies confirm the ethnic diversity that characterized this borderland region. The landscape itself reflects this cultural mixing. Celtic burial mounds, Roman road foundations, Slavic village layouts, and Germanic church architecture create a physical record of the ethnic complexity that Hitler's ancestors navigated daily. Understanding this environment is crucial to understanding how a family from this region could produce someone so obsessed with racial purity. It was a psychological reaction against the reality of their own heritage. The gaps in Hitler's genealogy are as significant as the documented connections. The paternity mystery surrounding Alois Hitler remains unsolved despite decades of research by professional genealogists and amateur investigators. Church records from the relevant period show multiple erasures and overwrites, suggesting deliberate concealment of embarrassing information. Local oral traditions in the Waldviertel preserve stories about the Hitler family that have never been officially documented, including rumors about Jewish ancestry, criminal behavior, and sexual scandal that would have motivated genealogical cover-ups. The potential Jewish connection through the Frankenberger family has been neither confirmed nor definitively disproven. While no records of payments to Maria Anna Schicklgruber have been found in Grad's archives, the absence of evidence doesn't prove absence. The systematic destruction of Jewish community records during the Holocaust makes verification impossible, but circumstantial evidence keeps the possibility alive. Hans Frank's testimony, while given under pressure during war crimes trials, contained specific details about dates, amounts, and family names that suggest access to documentary evidence that no longer exists. DNA analysis offers tantalizing clues, but no definitive answers. The E1b1b haplogroup found in Hitler's relatives could indicate Jewish ancestry, but it could equally represent the general ethnic mixing characteristic of Central European populations. Without DNA from Hitler himself, genealogists can only work with circumstantial genetic evidence from surviving relatives. Modern genetic genealogy techniques continue to reveal new connections and possibilities, but the fundamental questions about Hitler's ancestry may never be fully resolved. Cultural clues point to patterns of concealment that were common in 19th-century Austria. Name changes, religious conversions, and geographical mobility were standard strategies for families trying to escape stigmatizing associations. The Hitler family's behavior fits established patterns of genealogical reinvention that characterized upwardly mobile families throughout the Habsburg Empire. Understanding these patterns helps explain why so many questions about Hitler's ancestry remain unanswered. The family deliberately obscured its origins as part of a multi-generational strategy for social advancement. Tracing physical characteristics through Hitler's ancestry reveals patterns that contradict his later racial ideology. Contemporary descriptions of his ancestors consistently mention dark features, swarthy complexion, and non-Germanic appearance. Alois Hitler was described by customs colleagues as Mediterranean-looking, with dark hair and eyes that suggested Southern European heritage. Photographs of Hitler's relatives show facial features that would have failed his own racial classification tests, demonstrating the gap between his ideological claims and biological reality. The psychological traits prove even more significant than physical characteristics. Multiple generations of Hitler's ancestors showed patterns of authoritarian behavior, explosive tempers, and obsessive attention to social status. Alois's violent relationship with his son directly paralleled his own father's mysterious absence and the family's constant struggle for legitimacy. This pattern of absent or problematic fathers created a multi-generational cycle of identity, confusion, and compensatory authoritarianism that reached its culmination in Adolf's political career. Intelligence. Patterns in the family line show a consistent trend toward cunning rather than intellectual achievement. None of Hitler's documented ancestors achieved notable success in learning, arts, or sciences, but many demonstrated a remarkable ability to navigate complex social and bureaucratic systems. Alois's rise from illegitimate peasant birth to government official required sharp social intelligence and bureaucratic manipulation skills, traits his son would later demonstrate on a much larger scale. This pattern suggests genetic and cultural transmission of political intelligence rather than academic or creative ability. But perhaps most crucially, the family showed a multi-generational pattern of identity insecurity that would prove catastrophic when combined with political opportunity. Each generation struggled with questions of legitimacy, social belonging, and ethnic identity. The constant geographic mobility, name changes, and genealogical gaps created a family psychology characterized by rootlessness and compensatory grandiosity. This psychological inheritance would prove decisive when Adolf encountered the political chaos of post-World War I Germany. Personal traumas merged with national grievances to create the foundations of genocidal ideology. The religious evolution of Hitler's family reveals profound contradictions that illuminate the psychological foundations of his later political manipulation of religious sentiment. Starting as Catholic peasants in Counter-Reformation Austria, each generation grew more skeptical of church authority while maintaining outward religious conformity. Church attendance records show sporadic participation, financial contributions were minimal, and family members rarely took leadership roles in parish activities. Yet they maintained Catholic identity as a marker of social respectability, creating a pattern of religious cynicism masked by public conformity. Alois's anti-clerical attitudes were passed directly to Adolf, who would later exploit religious imagery while systematically undermining Christian institutions. The family's relationship with religious authority reflected broader patterns of opportunistic adaptation that characterized their survival strategies. Religion became a tool for social advancement rather than genuine spiritual commitment, prefiguring Adolf's later manipulation of religious sentiment for political purposes. The family's language heritage shows its Central European complexity in ways that contradict Hitler's later claims about linguistic purity. Multiple generations spoke German as a second language, with Czech, Austrian dialect, and local patois competing for primacy. Church records show baptisms conducted in Czech, German, and Latin, depending on the priest and congregation. Marriage documents include Czech phrases and Slavic naming patterns that persisted for generations. This linguistic instability may have contributed to Adolf's later obsession with German cultural purity, a psychological compensation for his family's actual multicultural heritage. Social mobility patterns reveal a family constantly climbing away from peasant origins through strategies that would later inform Adolf's political methodology. Each generation achieved a slightly higher status through strategic marriages, geographic relocation, and bureaucratic advancement. But this upward mobility came with profound insecurity about social acceptance, a psychological burden that would shape Adolf's relationship with German elite society. The family's experience of social climbing created expertise in reading and manipulating social hierarchies that Adolf would apply to political organization. Geographic influence proved decisive in shaping family character. The Austrian borderlands where Hitler's ancestors lived were characterized by ethnic mixing, cultural ambiguity, and political instability. Rather than the rooted Germanic heritage Adolf would later claim, his family embodied the rootless, adaptable survival strategies of border populations. They learned to change languages, religions, and even names as circumstances required, developing skills in deception and reinvention that would prove essential to Adolf's political career. How did 8 generations of Central European peasants produce Adolf Hitler? The answer lies in the intersection of genetic inheritance, psychological patterns, and historical opportunity. The family's multi-generational identity crisis created a personality type obsessed with belonging and legitimacy. Their experience of ethnic mixing generated both familiarity with diversity and anxiety about it. Their pattern of social climbing through bureaucratic service provided models for political advancement through institutional manipulation. Most crucially, their genealogical secrets created a psychology of projection. Unable to acknowledge his family's ethnic complexity, Adolf displaced his anxiety onto others, targeting for elimination the very diversity his own heritage embodied. The historical timing was perfect. A family shaped by 19th-century nationalist awakening, arriving at adulthood during Germany's post-World War I crisis of identity. The personal became political as Adolf's family traumas merged with national grievances, creating the psychological foundations for genocidal ideology. Today, Hitler's bloodline continues through descendants of his half-siblings, though most live in obscurity, having changed their names to escape their infamous heritage. Alois Hitler Jr.'s son, William Patrick Hitler, emigrated to the United States and served in the U.S. Navy during World War. He eventually settled in Long Island, where his descendants still live quietly. Angela Hitler's children and grandchildren scattered across Austria and Germany, maintaining the family's pattern of secrecy and geographic mobility. Genetic genealogy databases increasingly connect Hitler relatives with other Central European families, revealing the complex web of relationships that his racial ideology sought to deny. Understanding Hitler's ancestry doesn't excuse his crimes, but it does illuminate the psychological foundations of genocidal hatred. His family history reveals how personal shame about ethnic complexity can be transformed into political ideology, targeting the very diversity one embodies. The genealogical record demonstrates how 19th-century anxieties about legitimacy, ethnic purity, and social belonging created psychological conditions ripe for 20th-century extremism. Hitler's family traumas became Germany's national catastrophe, showing how individual psychological damage can scale up to historical significance when combined with political opportunity. Most importantly, Hitler's true family secret wasn't Jewish ancestry, uncertain paternity, or genealogical gaps. It was that his family embodied everything he claimed to oppose: diversity, adaptation, and the survival strategies of marginalized populations. The man who preached genetic purity was himself the product of precisely the kind of ethnic mixing his movement sought to eliminate. In attacking others, he was ultimately attacking himself, projecting his family's genealogical shame onto entire populations marked for destruction. The irony is complete. History's most notorious advocate of racial purity descended from the ethnically mixed, socially mobile, culturally complex population of Central Europe that defied every principle of his murderous ideology.